What's going on, addicts? Today we are talking Will Fuller, the wide receiver for the Houston Texans. So we have a very small sample size of what Will Fuller can do with quarterback Deshaun Watson based on the ACL tear that Watson experienced midway through the season last year. But we can still look back at the 2 years that Will Fuller has been in the league and just analyze his stats a little bit here. So last year, he only played 10 games. He was injured for quite a few of them. And in those 10 games, he only had 28 receptions, but he had 423 yards and 7 touchdowns. And it's important to remember that those 7 touchdowns actually came in 4 games. 4 consecutive games, I should say, with Deshaun Watson playing 3. He scored twice, and then 1, he only got 1 touchdown, but absolutely insane touchdown rate. There's no way that that's going to continue. I think that if you want to bet me on that, I'd be more than willing to take you up on that. It doesn't mean that Will Fuller isn't going to have a lot of touchdowns, but there's no way that you can continue that, because at that pace, I mean, he would have eclipsed over 20 touchdowns in a single season, and that's just not going to happen. Anyway, and he also missed a few games in his previous season, so injury history, a little bit murky. Doesn't really seem like he's dealing with anything right now. So again, my rule of thumb is if the player is going into the season healthy and we've at least seen some consistency, there's no real reason to try to predict injuries because it's near impossible to do that. But anyway, let's look at his game-by-game stats just a little bit further. So in the 4 games that we saw him with Deshaun Watson, he had the most receptions he ever had was 5. He had 2 games with 2 and 1 game with 4. But in those games, even the game they only had 2 receptions, he had 2 touchdowns in one of them and 1 in the other. So he was completely touchdown dependent. And if you look at the other player on his team, obviously DeAndre Hopkins had an insane target rate. I think he was approaching 30% of the entire share of the team's targets, which is also historically unsustainable. I mean, I think DeAndre Hopkins is good enough that if that happens again, I wouldn't be shocked. But if you're talking statistical regression, I think that DeAndre Hopkins' target share will go down a little bit. So that would help players like Will Fuller. There's not really any other playmakers that have come into the fold this year. The Texans didn't have any draft picks. And with Donta Foreman still dealing with that Achilles tear, Lamar Miller is pretty boring from the running back position. So it's likely that they're going to have to go to the air if they want to produce any yard work on the field. So I don't expect Will Fuller to play as he did after Deshaun Watson was out. I just don't think that it's really reasonable to expect over 20 touchdowns. But 10, 15, that's definitely in the ballpark. So what you're doing with Will Fuller, and this is basically the same commentary that I had in my Marvin Jones video, is you're dealing with a guy that in a PPR league is going to be very rewarding some weeks and very frustrating other weeks. So when you take Will Fuller, you better make sure that your roster is constructed in such a way that it can withstand the weeks where maybe he only has 2 receptions for 40 yards and gets you 6 points, because you're going to be stuck with that for quite a few games. Because if you look at those games, even with Watson, where he only had 2 receptions, if he didn't end up scoring a touchdown in those games, then it would have absolutely just tanked that week. Tanked your score for that week. So you have to be really willing to absorb that risk when you draft a player like Will Fuller, because you know the big games are going to come. As long as he's healthy and Deshaun Watson is healthy, I have no reason to suspect that some of the games that he had that he won't repeat. But you don't know when those games are going to come. So if you have a big enough roster and you have enough guys that are getting a decent floor week by week, I think Will Fuller is a good player. I think I have him ranked in my rankings a bit lower than the consensus, meaning I'm probably not going to end up with him on my teams. But if he falls a bit and I was able to land some steals early on in the draft, taking a shot at a player like Will Fuller is what makes fantasy football exciting and fun, because at the end of the day, players that can just electrify your scoreboard are players that you want to have on your team. But anyway, if you guys are curious how I rank Will Fuller in my tiers and how I rank every other player that's worth drafting, please please feel free to click the link in the description box below. You can access my PPR tiers, and I will send you guys updates throughout August into September, making sure that you guys are prepared for your drafts. But anyway, hope you guys found this enjoyable, and that this helped you guys kind of decide a little bit more whether or not to draft Will Fuller. Anyway, peace.